Mother's Day is for real mothers, Martha, not women who just sit around living in the past. My daughter-in-law said it while passing the mashed potatoes like she was commenting on the weather. For a second, nobody moved. The dining room became painfully quiet. Even the grandfather clock near the staircase sounded louder than usual. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel lowered his eyes to his plate. My son had always hated confrontation. Even as a child, he would leave the room whenever Harold and I argued about money or school or curfews. Back then, I used to think it meant he had a gentle heart. Now I understood it differently. Silence can become cruelty when it protects the wrong person. Emily dabbed the corners of her mouth with a napkin and sighed dramatically. We already made reservations tomorrow, she added. It's mostly for younger families anyway. Couples with kids. It just makes more sense this way. Makes more sense. I repeated the words quietly in my head while staring at the untouched food on my plate. The roasted chicken smelled of rosemary and lemon. Emily had spent all afternoon talking about the recipe like she was hosting a cooking show. Usually, I complimented her meals even when they were dry or oversalted. Tonight, I couldn't swallow a bite. Outside the kitchen window, rain slid slowly down the glass. It was the Saturday before Mother's Day, my first one without Harold. 8 months earlier, I had stood beside his hospital bed holding his hand while the machines slowed one by one. 39 years of marriage reduced to silence and paperwork. And now this. You're awfully quiet, Emily said with a thin smile. I looked at Daniel again. I kept waiting for him to defend me, to say, Mom belongs with us. Or, that's enough, Emily. But he only cleared his throat and took another sip of iced tea. That hurt more than her words ever could. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. Well, I said softly, forcing a smile polite enough to survive the moment. I hope you all enjoy yourselves tomorrow. Emily leaned back in her chair, relaxed, victorious, like someone who had finally removed an unwanted object from a room. I stood slowly and walked toward the stairs without another word. Nobody stopped me. Halfway up the staircase, I glanced toward the family photos lining the wall. There was Daniel at age 10 holding his first baseball trophy. There was our trip to Cape Cod. There was Harold teaching our granddaughter Ava how to fish at the lake. And there I was in every picture, smiling, cooking, holding babies, planning birthdays, keeping everyone together. Funny how quickly a family can rewrite your importance once the man who protected you is gone. Inside my bedroom, I shut the door gently behind me. Harold's side of the bed still looked wrong without him. Too neat, too untouched. I sat on the mattress and stared at his reading glasses resting on the nightstand. Some people think grief arrives loudly. For me, it arrived quietly. In empty chairs, in unused coffee mugs, in hearing only one set of footsteps at night. Downstairs, I could still hear faint laughter drifting through the vents. Emily's laugh carried the most. Sharp, bright, certain. I opened Harold's nightstand drawer out of habit. Inside were the small pieces of a life that had once felt permanent. His watch, a church bulletin folded twice, a receipt from the hardware store dated 3 weeks before his stroke. I touched the receipt carefully with my fingertips. My hands looked older lately, thinner, the veins more visible. Emily noticed things like that. I could tell. To her, aging was something embarrassing, something to move aside once it stopped being useful. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes. This wasn't the first time she had pushed me out, only the first time she had done it openly. Before Harold died, she hid it behind fake smiles and sugary compliments. Small things at first. Family photos online where everyone was tagged except me. Dinner plans discussed while I was still sitting in the room. Conversations that stopped whenever I entered the kitchen. And Daniel pretending not to notice every single time. A lump formed in my throat, but I forced it down. Crying wouldn't change anything. Harold used to tell me, never react while people are trying to diminish you. Quiet people see everything. At the time, I thought it was just another one of his strange old sayings. Now it felt like advice. I stood and walked toward the closet. On the top shelf sat a small brown leather box Harold had asked me to keep safe years ago. Inside were documents, property papers, bank records, old insurance files, and beneath them all rested a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Harold's careful handwriting. Martha, nothing else. I stared at it for a long moment, but didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I returned the box to the shelf and turned off the bedroom light. Rain hammered harder against the windows now. Around midnight, I heard Daniel and Emily come upstairs laughing softly together. Their bedroom door closed. A few seconds later, Emily laughed again. Comfortable, confident, like a woman completely certain she had already won. But the next morning, while they were getting dressed for their expensive Mother's Day brunch downtown, I drove somewhere they never expected me to go. I drove to the bank Harold had trusted for over 30 years. The bank smelled exactly the way it had 20 years ago. Polished wood, old paper, burnt coffee from the employee break room down the hall. Some places survive by refusing to change. Harold used to love that about this branch. Big banks forget your name, he always said. Small banks remember your life. I sat quietly in the waiting area near the window while rain slid down the glass outside. Around me, people moved through their Saturday routines carrying umbrellas and paper cups and grocery bags. Normal lives. Normal families. I wondered how many of them would someday become strangers inside their own homes. A young teller approached me with a polite smile. "Mrs. Whitaker? Mr. Bennett is ready for you." I followed her slowly down the hallway. Frank Bennett had managed Harold's accounts for almost 3 decades. He looked older now, thinner around the shoulders, his hair nearly white. But the moment he saw me, his expression softened. "Martha," he said gently, "I was wondering when I might see you." That sentence alone nearly broke me. Not because it was emotional, because someone still expected me to exist. He guided me into his office and closed the door quietly behind us. Rain tapped against the windows while he removed his glasses and folded his hands across the desk. "How are you holding up?" he asked. People had been asking me that for 8 months. At church, at the grocery store, at Harold's funeral. I always gave them the same answer. "Oh, I'm managing." But sitting in that office, surrounded by Harold's familiar world, I suddenly felt too tired to lie. "I don't think my family wants me around anymore," I admitted softly. Frank didn't look surprised. That frightened me more than anything. He opened a drawer and removed a folder thick with documents. "Harold came to see me several times before his stroke," he said carefully. "He was concerned about certain things. Certain things. Even then, Harold had protected people with soft language." I stared at the folder without touching it. "What kind of things?" Frank hesitated for only a second. "Your daughter-in-law's interest in the house. The accounts. Daniel's sudden financial decisions." A cold feeling spread through my chest. Months earlier, Daniel had casually mentioned refinancing the property taxes. Then Emily brought up selling the lake cabin Harold inherited from his father. At the time, I thought they were simply trying to help. Now I wasn't so sure. Frank slid one document toward me. This trust was updated 6 months before Harold passed. I adjusted my glasses and looked down at the paper. My husband's signature sat near the bottom of the page in blue ink. Strong, steady, certain. My throat tightened. "He knew?" I whispered. Frank leaned back quietly. I believe Harold saw more than he let on. Outside the office window, thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. I suddenly remembered one night from the previous winter. Harold standing silently in the kitchen while Emily talked excitedly about remodeling the downstairs level after everyone's situation changes. At the time, I thought she meant retirement. Now the memory sounded different. Like planning. I looked back down at the paperwork. The trust placed the house entirely under my protection while I remained alive. No sale, no transfer, no forced relocation. Without my written approval. And if anyone attempted to pressure me financially, additional restrictions would activate automatically. Harold had built safeguards. Quiet ones. The kind nobody noticed until it was too late. A shaky breath escaped my chest. For months, I had blamed myself for the distance growing inside the family. I kept wondering if grief had made me difficult, too emotional, too sensitive, too old-fashioned. But sitting in that office, I felt something change inside me. Not anger. Clarity. Frank studied me carefully across the desk. "There's something else," he said. I looked up. 3 weeks after Harold's funeral, Daniel requested information about transferring ownership structures. I felt physically ill. Not because of the money. Because of the timing. 3 weeks. Harold's clothes were still hanging in the closet. His toothbrush was still beside mine in the bathroom. And my son was already asking how to move things into his name. I pressed my fingers together tightly in my lap. Did Emily come with him? Frank gave a slow nod. Of course she did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain outside had softened into a steady gray drizzle. Somewhere down the hallway, a printer hummed quietly. Ordinary sounds. But my entire life suddenly felt rearranged. I don't understand how everything changed so quickly, I whispered. Frank's expression saddened. Sometimes people wait for the person protecting you to disappear. Those words stayed with me. Because Harold had protected me. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just steadily. He interrupted Emily whenever her jokes became too sharp. He redirected conversations when Daniel grew impatient with me. He made sure I never felt alone at the dinner table. And after he died, the balance disappeared almost overnight. I stared again at Harold's signature on the trust papers. Even now, he was still trying to take care of me. A warmth spread painfully through my chest. I missed him so much in that moment that I could barely breathe. Frank carefully closed the folder. These documents stay protected here, he said. And Martha, do not sign anything your son brings you without legal review first. I nodded. Slowly, for the first time in months, I stopped feeling confused. The loneliness was still there. The grief was still there. But confusion had been replaced by something colder. Awareness. When I finally stepped back outside, the rain had stopped. Clouds drifted slowly across the pale morning sky, while sunlight pushed through in thin silver streaks. Families filled the sidewalks carrying flowers and brunch reservations and balloons for Mother's Day weekend. I watched them quietly from the parking lot. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. 3 missed messages from Daniel. None from Emily. The first read, "Mom, where are you?" The second, "We're leaving soon." The third came 5 minutes later. "You could at least answer." I stared at the screen for a long moment before locking the phone again. Then I got into my car and drove somewhere they never imagined I would go next. I drove to the lake house. Harold used to call it the only honest place left in Connecticut. It sat nearly 2 hours from town, hidden behind old maple trees and a gravel road most GPS systems barely recognized. The cabin had belonged to Harold's father before it became ours. Every summer, Daniel spent weeks there fishing off the dock and chasing frogs through the reeds. Back then, he still held my hand in public. Funny how motherhood works. You spend years teaching a child to walk away from you. Then one day, they finally do. The closer I got to the lake, the quieter the world became. The roads narrowed. Storefronts disappeared. Even the air smelled different out there. Pine trees, wet earth, rain drying on old wood. For the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling watched. When I parked beside the cabin, I sat in the car for a moment staring at the porch swing moving gently in the wind. Harold built that swing himself 12 years ago after I mentioned wanting somewhere to drink coffee in the mornings. He remembered small things like that. That was his kind of love. Steady, practical, quiet. I stepped out slowly and climbed the porch stairs. The screen door creaked the same way it always had. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar and old books. Nothing had changed. A folded blanket still rested across Harold's favorite chair near the fireplace. His fishing hat hung beside the back door. For one dangerous second, I forgot he was gone. I almost called his name. Instead, I stood there silently listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of water brushing against the dock outside. No tension, no Emily, no careful silence at the dinner table. Just peace. I walked into the kitchen and opened the cabinets automatically. Harold always kept canned soup, crackers, and coffee stocked for unexpected weekends. Everything was still there. My chest tightened again. Grief is strange. Sometimes it arrives all at once. Other times it hides quietly inside ordinary objects. A coffee mug, a jacket, a half-used bottle of aspirin. I made myself a cup of coffee and carried it onto the porch. The lake stretched gray and calm beneath the cloudy afternoon sky. Harold and I spent nearly every anniversary here after Daniel moved out. We used to sit for hours without speaking much. We were never one of those couples who needed constant conversation to prove love existed. Silence can feel safe when it comes from the right person. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and finally looked at my phone again. 7 missed calls now. 4 messages from Daniel. 1 voicemail. Still nothing from Emily. I opened the first text. "Mom, where did you go?" The second, "We waited for you at brunch." The third came 20 minutes later. "You embarrassed us." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "We're worried." Just, "You embarrassed us." I suddenly remembered Daniel at age 7 standing in the kitchen crying because he had broken Harold's watch while playing superhero. He kept repeating, "Dad's gonna be mad. Dad's gonna be mad." But Harold simply looked at him and said, "It's only a thing, son. You matter more." That was the kind of father he was. And somehow, despite having that example his entire life, Daniel still became a man who worried more about appearances than people. The voicemail notification blinked at the bottom of the screen. I pressed play. "Mom," Daniel sighed heavily. "I don't understand why you're making this into such a huge issue. Emily was only trying to avoid awkwardness tomorrow. You know how emotional things have been since Dad passed." I almost laughed. Emotional. Such a convenient word. People use it whenever they want to dismiss pain they caused themselves. His voice continued. "Can you please just answer your phone?" Then silence. No apology. No anger either. Just exhaustion. Like I had become another responsibility he no longer wanted to manage. I set the phone face down on the porch table. Across the lake, wind rippled through the water in slow silver lines. Somewhere nearby, a boat engine hummed faintly in the distance. For the first time since Harold died, I allowed myself to think something I had been avoiding for months. Emily wasn't the only problem. Daniel had been letting this happen piece by piece. Maybe because confronting her was harder. Maybe because disappointing me felt safer than disappointing his wife. Either way, the result was the same. I was becoming unwelcome in the family I built. The realization should have shattered me. Instead, it made something inside me strangely calm. I finished my coffee and walked back inside the cabin. Near the fireplace sat an old wooden cabinet where Harold kept important documents whenever we stayed there during tax season. Most of the drawers contained boring things. Utility bills, insurance forms, old receipts. But inside the bottom drawer, I found a yellow legal pad covered in Harold's handwriting. My pulse slowed. Harold documented everything. Grocery lists, boat repairs, investment notes. But this notebook was different. Names, dates, observations. I sat slowly at the dining table while rain clouds darkened the windows again overhead. One page caught my attention immediately. March 14th. Emily asked Daniel again about convincing Martha to downsize. Daniel uncomfortable. Need to make sure Martha protected no matter what happens. I stopped breathing for a second. Another note farther down the page. April 2nd. Heard Emily on phone discussing property value with someone before funeral plans even finalized. My hands trembled slightly against the paper. Harold knew. Not just suspected. Knew. And suddenly, sitting alone in that quiet cabin surrounded by the life we built together, I realized my husband had spent his final months trying to prepare for something I had been too blind to see. I barely slept that night at the lake house. Rain drifted on and off across the roof while the old trees outside scraped softly against the windows. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up trying to rest and walked into the kitchen wearing Harold's flannel robe. The cabin felt colder without him. Not physically, emotionally. I switched on the small light above the stove and sat at the table with Harold's yellow notebook still open in front of me. The pages looked ordinary enough. Grocery reminders, fuel receipts for the fishing boat, notes about replacing the dock before winter. Then suddenly, between those normal pieces of life, came sentences that changed everything. May 9th. Emily asked whether Martha would ever consider assisted living. June 2nd. Daniel says Mom gets confused sometimes. Not true. July 11th. Need to finalize trust before surgery. I read those lines over and over again while my coffee turned cold beside me. Confused. That word stayed in my head. I wasn't confused. I still balanced my own checkbook. I still drove myself everywhere. I still volunteered twice a month at church. But I remembered small moments now. Emily correcting me loudly in restaurants even when I wasn't wrong. Daniel taking over conversations before I finished speaking. The way Emily once laughed after I forgot where I left my reading glasses. "We should probably bubble wrap Martha," she joked. Everyone chuckled politely, including Daniel. At the time, I forced myself to smile too. That's what women from my generation do. We smooth uncomfortable moments so other people can stay comfortable. But sitting alone in that dim kitchen, I realized something painful. Emily had been building a story about me for months. Fragile, forgetful, dependent. A woman slowly becoming incapable of managing her own life. And the worst part? People believe repeated things eventually. Even family. I closed the notebook carefully and stared out the dark kitchen window. My reflection looked tired, older than I remembered. Grief ages you quietly. Not all at once. Little by little. I suddenly remembered the afternoon Harold came home from his final doctor appointment before surgery. We sat on this exact porch watching the lake while he drank iced tea from a chipped red mug. "You know Daniel loves you," he said out of nowhere. I laughed softly back then. Of course he does. But Harold didn't smile. He's weak around strong personalities. At the time, I knew he meant Emily. She had opinions about everything. Where holidays should be hosted, what school Ava should attend, which neighborhoods were declining, even what kind of clothes looked appropriate for women over 60. Emily spoke with the confidence of someone who had never doubted herself a single day in her life. People like that often confuse control with intelligence. I remember Harold staring quietly across the water that evening before adding, "If anything ever happens to me, promise you won't let yourself get pushed aside." I teased him for sounding dramatic. Now I wished I had listened more carefully. The next morning, sunlight finally broke through the clouds. Thin golden light spilled across the lake while birds moved through the trees outside. For the first time in months, I made breakfast only for myself. 2 eggs, toast, black coffee, no rushing, no tension sitting across the table pretending to be politeness. After breakfast, I walked down toward the dock wearing Harold's old navy sweatshirt. The wood creaked beneath my feet exactly the way it always had. Harold taught Daniel to fish from this dock when he was 6 years old. I can still picture them clearly. Daniel proudly holding up tiny sunfish with both hands. Harold laughing beside him. Back then, my son used to look at me like I was the safest person in the world. I don't know exactly when that changed. Maybe marriage changes people slowly. Or maybe certain parts were always there waiting for permission to grow. My phone buzzed again inside my pocket. "Daniel." This time I answered. "Mom," he said immediately, sounding irritated more than relieved. "Where are you?" "At the lake house." A pause. "You just disappeared." "Yesterday." I looked out across the water before responding. I didn't realize anyone wanted me around. Another silence. Then the sigh. That sigh again. The one that made me feel like a burden instead of a mother. "Emily feels terrible about what happened," he said finally. I almost smiled at that. Not, "She's sorry." Not, "She was wrong." Just, "She feels terrible." Carefully chosen words. "I see," I answered quietly. Daniel lowered his voice. "You know how emotional Mother's Day is for her." The sentence settled into my chest like ice. Emotional for her. Not for the woman who buried her husband 8 months ago. Not for the woman who spent 37 years raising him. For Emily. I closed my eyes briefly. "You know," I said softly, "your father never allowed anyone to speak to me that way." Daniel sounded exhausted now. "Can we not do this today?" There it was. The real problem. Not what happened. Not the cruelty. Just my unwillingness to quietly absorb it anymore. I heard Emily's voice faintly in the background asking who he was talking to. Then softer. More distant. Just let her cool off. Cool off. Like I was some emotional old woman having a tantrum. Something inside me hardened permanently in that moment. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Like a door locking. "I think I'm going to stay here a few more days," I told him. "Mom, I'll talk to you later." Then I ended the call. The lake remained calm in front of me. Wind moved gently through the trees while sunlight flickered across the water in soft silver patterns. For the first time since Harold died, I stopped asking myself how to fix the family. Instead, I began wondering whether the family I missed even existed anymore. I stayed at the lake house 3 more days. Not because anyone asked me to. Because for the first time in months, I felt calmer away from my own family. The mornings there were quiet in a way that didn't feel lonely. Sunlight spilled softly across the kitchen floorboards while the coffee maker hissed in the background. Sometimes I sat on the porch for hours watching boats drift across the water. Nobody criticized how long I stayed seated. Nobody sighed when I repeated a story. Nobody treated me like old furniture taking up space. By Tuesday afternoon, I realized something uncomfortable. Peace had started feeling unfamiliar inside my own home. That thought followed me everywhere. While washing dishes. While folding blankets. While rereading Harold's notes at night beneath the small lamp near the fireplace. I kept returning to the same sentence over and over again. Need to make sure Martha protected no matter what happens. Protected from what? Or maybe the better question was, protected from who? Late Tuesday evening, my phone rang again. Frank Bennett. I answered immediately. "Martha," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something important." Something in his voice made my stomach tighten. Of course. There was a brief pause before he continued. Has Daniel mentioned power of attorney recently? I stared out the cabin window toward the dark lake. No, another pause. Then Frank exhaled quietly. He contacted the bank yesterday, asking questions about your cognitive condition. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood him. My what? Your cognitive condition, Frank repeated gently. He implied there may be concerns about memory decline and decision-making. The room became very still around me. I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me, wind brushing tree branches outside. My own heartbeat. Confused. Fragile. Forgetful. Now the pattern finally made sense. Emily wasn't casually insulting me. She was building evidence. Small comments repeated often enough to sound believable. The forgotten glasses. The jokes about aging. Correcting me in front of people. Speaking slowly to me at restaurants like I was struggling to keep up. Piece by piece. Like laying bricks. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. What exactly did Daniel say? Frank hesitated. He asked what would happen if you became unable to manage your own affairs. Unable. Such a clean word for something so cruel. I closed my eyes briefly. Harold knew. That was why he updated the trust. That was why he documented everything. He saw it coming long before I did. Martha, Frank said softly, I strongly suggest you speak with an attorney independent from the family. Family. The words sounded strange now, like something from another lifetime. After we ended the call, I remained sitting at the table for a very long time without moving. Outside, evening settled quietly over the lake. The last orange light faded behind the trees while shadows filled the cabin room by room. I suddenly remembered a dinner from nearly a year earlier. Emily pouring wine for guests during Thanksgiving. One of her friends asked whether Harold and I planned to travel more after retirement. Before I could answer, Emily laughed lightly and said, Oh, Martha gets overwhelmed pretty easily these days. We try not to confuse her with too many plans. Everyone chuckled politely. Even me. Because nice women are taught to survive humiliation by pretending it doesn't hurt. Now I wondered how many other moments I ignored. How many little cuts I dismissed because I wanted peace more than truth. My chest tightened painfully. Not because of Emily anymore. Because Daniel participated in it. Maybe not enthusiastically. Maybe not proudly. But quietly. Consistently. And sometimes quiet betrayal leaves the deepest wound. I stood and walked toward the hallway mirror near the front door. The woman staring back at me looked tired, yes. Older, certainly. But not confused. Not incapable. Not weak. I touched the edge of the mirror lightly. Then I heard Harold's voice inside my memory again. If someone keeps trying to convince the world you're powerless, ask yourself what they gain from it. At the time, he had been talking about a dishonest contractor at the marina. But now the words meant something else entirely. I slept very little that night. Around dawn, I made coffee and carried Harold's notebook onto the porch. Fog hovered low across the lake while birds moved through the trees in soft bursts of sound. I opened the notebook again. Another entry caught my attention this time. August 18th. Daniel says Emily worried Martha will cling to the house forever. Cling. Interesting word. Not live in. Not cherish. Not protect. Cling. As if I were some lonely old woman refusing to let go instead of the person who spent 38 years paying that mortgage beside her husband. I suddenly felt embarrassed for all the times I apologized unnecessarily. Sorry for forgetting a casserole dish at church. Sorry for asking Daniel to repeat himself. Sorry for existing too loudly in spaces that once belonged to me. The realization settled heavily across my chest. They had slowly trained me to shrink myself. And grief made it easier. Grieving people doubt themselves. Widows especially. People speak over you long enough. Eventually you stop trusting your own instincts. But Harold trusted them. That mattered. A car passed slowly along the gravel road outside the cabin, pulling me from my thoughts. For one strange second, panic rushed through me. I thought it might be Daniel. Or Emily. But the vehicle continued past the property without stopping. Still, my pulse stayed elevated afterward. Because another realization had finally begun taking shape inside my mind. This wasn't only about disrespect anymore. It was about positioning, control, preparation. And for the first time since Harold died, I stopped feeling merely hurt. I started feeling careful. Very careful. That afternoon, while organizing papers inside the study, I found something else hidden beneath Harold's old tax folders. A business card. Simple white lettering. Margaret Ellis. Elder law attorney. And written on the back in Harold's handwriting were 4 words that changed everything. If anything happens first. I called Margaret Ellis the next morning. Her office was in Hartford, nearly an hour from the lake house. Calm voice. No unnecessary warmth. The kind of woman who sounded like she had spent her life listening carefully before speaking. When I mentioned Harold's name, she became quiet for a moment. Yes, she said finally. Your husband contacted me several times before his surgery. That sentence settled heavily inside my chest. Several times. Not once. Not casually. Harold had been planning for something. I found your card in his study, I told her. I wondered when you might, she replied softly. We arranged to meet that afternoon. The drive into Hartford felt strange after days at the lake. More traffic. More noise. Buildings replacing trees. Life moving quickly. Around people too busy to notice one another. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in my car watching office workers hurry across the sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Nobody looked up. For years, I used to think invisibility came with aging. Now I understood something different. People only stop seeing you when they decide your usefulness has ended. Margaret's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building above a bookstore. The waiting room smelled faintly of lavender and paper. No television. No loud receptionist. Just quiet. A young assistant offered me tea while I waited. 5 minutes later, Margaret herself appeared in the doorway. She looked to be in her late 60s. Silver hair cut neatly at her shoulders. Sharp eyes behind thin-framed glasses. The kind of woman Emily would probably describe as intimidating. I liked her immediately. Martha, she said warmly, shaking my hand. Harold spoke very highly of you. That nearly broke me. Not because it was dramatic. Because nobody had spoken about Harold gently in weeks. Everyone else treated him like a completed administrative task. Death certificate. Funeral flowers. Canceled prescriptions. But Margaret said his name like he still mattered. Inside her office, she closed the door and opened a thick folder already waiting on her desk. My name was written across the tab. Martha Whitaker. Seeing it there sent a chill through me. Harold had prepared this long before he died. Margaret adjusted her glasses and studied me carefully. I'm going to ask you something difficult, she said. Has your son or daughter-in-law attempted to discuss your competency? The word landed hard. Competency. Such a cold legal word for dignity. I nodded slowly. Not directly, I admitted. But they've implied things. Margaret gave a small, unsurprised nod. Then she opened the folder. Inside were copies of trust documents, property protections, financial directives, and handwritten notes from Harold himself. One note had been clipped separately near the top. If Martha ever begins doubting herself, remind her this. She is stronger than both of them combined. I looked away immediately. My vision blurred. Harold knew me too well. He understood exactly what grief would do. It makes widows apologize for taking up space. Margaret allowed me a moment before continuing. Your husband was concerned about coercive financial behavior. Another careful phrase. People in professional offices always use soft language for ugly things. Coercive financial behavior. What she meant was, people trying to take advantage of an elderly widow. I folded my hands tightly together in my lap. He believed Emily was influencing Daniel aggressively regarding the house and estate planning. Margaret continued. Especially after his health declined. Health declined. Another soft phrase. Everything about aging gets softened until nobody notices the cruelty anymore. I stared down at Harold's notes while Margaret spoke. She also contacted a real estate consultant 6 weeks before your husband's funeral. My head lifted immediately. What? Margaret slid a printed email across the desk. There it was. Emily asking about estimated resale value for the family home following future ownership transition. Future ownership transition. Harold was still alive when she wrote it. Something cold moved through my body then. Not shock anymore. Not sadness either. Recognition. This woman had been waiting. Planning. Positioning herself carefully while I sat beside hospital beds, praying my husband would survive. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Martha, I need you to listen carefully. Everything your husband structured was designed to protect your autonomy. But protection only works if you stop second-guessing your instincts. Autonomy. Another legal word. But this one felt powerful. I nodded slowly. For months, I had treated every uncomfortable feeling like grief. Every moment of disrespect like misunderstanding. Every insult like sensitivity on my part. Now those excuses were disappearing one by one. Margaret handed me another document. If anyone attempts guardianship claims or cognitive concerns, this activates immediate independent evaluation procedures. I blinked at the paper. Guardianship? Yes. The room suddenly felt colder. Guardianship. Meaning, declaring someone incapable. Controlling where they live, what they sign, who manages their money. I suddenly remembered Emily joking last Christmas. We'll probably have to put Martha somewhere tropical eventually, so she stops freezing all winter. Everyone laughed, including me, because women my age are taught to survive humiliation by making ourselves smaller than it. Margaret watched my expression carefully. You didn't know how serious this had become, she said quietly. No, I admitted. Then softer, I think Harold did. Margaret gave a slow nod. He loved you very much. That sentence hurt more than anything else that afternoon, because I realized my husband spent his final months preparing for a battle he knew I might face alone. A battle against my own family. When the meeting finally ended, Margaret walked me toward the front door herself. Before I left, she touched my arm gently. One more thing, she said. I looked back. People trying to manipulate you depend on confusion. The moment you become calm, informed, and patient, they lose control. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the sidewalk in long golden lines. I stood there quietly for a moment, holding my folder against my chest while traffic moved past the building. Then my phone buzzed again. Daniel. This time there was no voicemail. Only a text. Emily thinks we should all sit down together when you get home and discuss what's best moving forward. I read it twice. Then a third time. What's best moving forward? Not, how are you? Not, we miss you. Just another carefully polished sentence hiding something underneath it. For the first time since Harold died, I didn't feel hurt reading Daniel's messages. I felt prepared. I waited 2 more days before going home. Not because I was afraid, because I needed time to think clearly without Emily's voice filling every room. By Friday morning, the lake house no longer felt peaceful. It felt temporary, like hiding. And Harold never raised me to hide. The drive back felt longer than usual. Gray clouds stretched across the highway while old rock songs played softly through the radio. At one point, I caught myself gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Not from fear, from disappointment. I kept remembering Daniel as a little boy sleeping against my shoulder after long car rides. Back then, he trusted me completely. Now he questioned whether I could manage my own affairs. Life changes quietly like that. One small compromise at a time. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same. White shutters, blue hydrangeas near the walkway, Harold's wind chimes moving softly on the porch. But something inside me had changed. I noticed it immediately. For months, I walked into that house feeling uncertain, careful, defensive. This time, I walked in calmly, like someone finally seeing the room clearly after years of bad lighting. Emily was in the kitchen arranging flowers when I entered. Pink roses. Expensive ones. She looked up quickly, surprised for half a second before her smile appeared. Martha, she said brightly. You're back. Not, we missed you. Just, you're back. I placed my purse quietly on the counter. Yes. She studied my face carefully. People like Emily are always studying reactions, measuring weakness, looking for emotional openings. I was starting to get worried, she said, adjusting the flowers. Daniel said you weren't answering much. Interesting. Not, I was worried. Daniel was worried. Emily rarely attached herself directly to uncomfortable emotions. She used other people as shields. I needed some quiet, I answered. Her smile tightened almost invisibly. Well, she sighed lightly. Things got awkward after you left. Awkward. There was that soft language again. Like banning a widow from Mother's Day was merely an unfortunate misunderstanding. I glanced around the kitchen slowly. Something was different. Then I noticed it. The framed family photo near the refrigerator had been replaced. The old one showed Harold sitting between Daniel and me during Christmas 2 years earlier. Now it was gone. In its place sat a newer photo. Daniel, Emily, Ava, no me, no Harold. Just the new version of the family. Emily followed my eyes and smiled casually. Oh, I updated some pictures while you were away. Of course she did. I nodded once. Nothing more. That seemed to bother her slightly. Usually by now, I would apologize. For tension I didn't create, or force politeness to smooth things over. Not this time. Silence unsettles manipulative people more than anger does. A few minutes later, Daniel came downstairs from his office. Relief crossed his face when he saw me, but guilt followed immediately after. "Mom," he said carefully, "you should have told us where you were staying." I looked at him quietly. "The lake house belongs to me too." His expression shifted slightly, only for a second, but I saw it. That sentence mattered more than it should have. Emily turned back toward the sink. "We were mostly worried because you stopped answering calls." Again, worried. Always worried. Never sorry. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Listen, Emily thought maybe tonight we could all sit down together and talk." There it was. The meeting. I remembered Margaret's words immediately. People trying to manipulate you depend on confusion. I set my keys gently onto the counter. "Talk about what?" Daniel hesitated. Emily answered for him. "The future." Such a polished answer. "The house is a lot for one person now," she continued carefully. "And honestly, we've all noticed you seem overwhelmed lately." Overwhelmed. Another word added to the collection. Confused. Emotional. Forgetful. Overwhelmed. I almost admired how strategic it was. Never direct insults. Just soft descriptions repeated often enough to reshape perception. I looked at Daniel. "Have you noticed that too?" His eyes dropped briefly. "That's not what we're saying." But it was exactly what they were saying. Emily stepped closer, lowering her voice into something almost maternal. "We love you, Martha. We just want to make sure you're protected." Protected. I nearly laughed. Funny how often people use that word right before trying to take control from someone else. "I appreciate the concern," I answered calmly. Emily blinked slightly. She expected resistance. Or tears. Maybe both. Not calm. Daniel seemed relieved that I wasn't arguing. "Good," he said quickly. "Then maybe tonight we can discuss some practical options." Practical options. Another careful phrase. No one ever says, "We're trying to push you out." Instead they say, "What's best moving forward?" I excused myself quietly and carried my suitcase upstairs. The hallway felt strangely unfamiliar now. Halfway to my bedroom, I noticed another change. Harold's coat rack near the linen closet was gone. In its place stood a decorative mirror Emily must have bought recently. I stopped walking. That coat rack had been there 23 years. Harold hung his jackets there every winter. Suddenly, I understood something deeply unsettling. Emily wasn't only trying to remove me. She was removing him too. Little traces at a time. A replaced photograph. A missing coat rack. A rewritten atmosphere. Like the house itself was being trained to forget us. Inside my bedroom, I closed the door quietly and sat on the edge of the bed. Everything looked mostly the same, but not completely. Harold's slippers were gone from beside the closet. I stared at the empty space for a long moment. Then slowly, very slowly, I opened the nightstand drawer where I kept Margaret's documents. I rested my hand gently on the folder. For the first time since returning home, I finally understood something important. Emily thought this conversation tonight would weaken me. She had no idea it was about to do the exact opposite. Dinner started exactly at 6:30. Emily always preferred eating early. She claimed it was healthier, but Harold used to joke that she simply liked controlling the schedule before anyone else had a chance to disagree. The dining room looked beautiful. Candles lit. Linen napkins folded perfectly. Soft jazz drifting from the kitchen speaker. From the outside, we probably looked like one of those polished suburban families people envy online. That's the strange thing about dysfunction. Sometimes it wears pearls and smiles. Emily served salmon with roasted vegetables onto our plates while Daniel poured wine. Nobody mentioned Mother's Day anymore. That silence itself felt deliberate, like everyone had quietly agreed to pretend the humiliation never happened. I noticed something else too. Neither of them asked about the lake house. Not directly, which meant they already knew enough to be careful. Emily sat across from me in a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my first car. Perfect makeup, perfect posture, perfect concern. "Martha," she began gently, "we've been thinking a lot about how hard this year has been for you." There it was. The performance. I cut a small piece of salmon slowly and waited. Daniel cleared his throat. "We just want to make sure you have support." Support. Another soft word hiding sharp intentions. "I see," I answered quietly. Emily offered me a sympathetic smile that never reached her eyes. "You've been through so much emotionally since Harold passed." Emotionally. Again. Interesting how every conversation returned to my supposed instability. "I'm grieving my husband," I replied calmly. "That seems normal." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Emily smiled tighter. Of course, nobody's questioning that. But they were. Not directly. Strategically. Like people testing ice before stepping fully onto it. A long silence settled across the table. Then Daniel finally said it. We think it may be time to consider simplifying things. Simplifying. I almost admired how carefully they avoided honest language. Nobody says, we want control. Instead they say, we want to help. I set my fork down gently. What exactly does simplifying mean? Daniel looked toward Emily briefly before answering. Well, the house is large. Expensive. A lot to maintain. Emily jumped in smoothly. And there are wonderful communities now for active seniors. Beautiful places. Social activities. Security. Active seniors. Communities. Security. Every sentence wrapped in pleasant packaging. But underneath it sat the same message. Move out. Disappear quietly. I looked around the dining room slowly. Harold refinished this table himself one summer after buying it from an antique store in Vermont. The chandelier above us was installed the year Daniel graduated college. Every corner of this house held pieces of our life. And now they spoke about it like inconvenient square footage. I'm comfortable here, I said softly. Emily tilted her head sympathetically. But comfort and safety aren't always the same thing. There it was again. Safety. Protection. Concern. I wondered how long they practiced these conversations privately before bringing them to me. Daniel rubbed his hands together nervously. We're not trying to pressure you, Mom. That sentence told me everything. People rarely mention pressure unless they know it exists. I reached for my water glass calmly. Then why does this feel rehearsed? The room became still. Emily recovered first. We're just trying to be proactive. Proactive. Another polished word. I almost smiled. Harold would have noticed this immediately. He hated manipulative language. Said it made dishonest people feel intelligent. Emily leaned forward slightly. We also think it would help if someone assisted with managing finances moving forward. There it was. Finally. Not the house. Not grief. Control. Daniel spoke quickly after that. Just temporarily. Until things stabilize. Things stabilize. As if I were some unstable patient recovering from surgery instead of a widow mourning her husband. I looked directly at my son. Do you believe I can't manage my own finances? His face flushed immediately. That's not what I said. But again, it was exactly what he said. Emily reached across the table and touched his wrist gently. A calming gesture. Strategic. Always strategic. Martha, she said softly. Sometimes after loss, people make emotional decisions without realizing it. I suddenly remembered Frank telling me about Daniel contacting the bank regarding my cognitive condition. The pieces fit together so cleanly now. This dinner wasn't spontaneous. It was step 2. Establish concern. Create doubt. Introduce supervision. Then eventually, control. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate. The movement alone made both of them tense slightly. Interesting. They expected emotional reactions, not calmness. I met with an attorney this week, I said quietly. The change in Emily's expression lasted less than a second. But I saw it. Fear. Tiny. Controlled. Real. Daniel blinked. An attorney? Yes. Silence filled the room again. The jazz music from the kitchen suddenly sounded absurdly cheerful. Emily recovered quickly. Well, that's probably smart. But her voice had changed slightly. Sharper now. Careful. I looked at both of them calmly. Harold made extensive arrangements before he passed. Neither spoke. I continued softly. He seemed concerned about protecting me. Daniel stared at the table. Emily's fingers tightened around her wine glass. And suddenly I understood something important. They didn't know how much Harold knew. That uncertainty frightened them. Good. For months, I had been the confused one. The grieving widow trying to understand shifting behavior and careful insults. Now the confusion belonged to them. Emily forced another smile. Nobody wants conflict here. No, I answered quietly. I suppose they don't. The room went still again. Then Daniel sighed heavily, like an exhausted parent dealing with a difficult child. Mom, nobody's attacking you. I looked at him for a long moment. Then finally said the thing I had been holding inside for days. You told the bank I might be mentally declining. His face lost color instantly. Emily froze beside him. Nobody spoke. Not even the music seemed loud anymore. Daniel opened his mouth once, closed it again, then finally whispered, Who told you that? And right there, in the silence that followed, I realized something deeply satisfying. For the first time since Harold died, They were the ones feeling uncertain at this table. Daniel stared at me like he no longer recognized the woman sitting across the table. For a moment, nobody moved. The candles flickered softly between us, while the jazz music continued playing from the kitchen speaker as if nothing had happened. Emily recovered first. Of course she did. People like her survive by adapting quickly. Martha, she said carefully, lowering her voice. I think you may have misunderstood something. Misunderstood. There it was again. Another attempt to make me question my own reality. I looked directly at her. Did I? Her expression tightened almost invisibly. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face before speaking. Mom, I only asked general questions. Frank completely overreacted. General questions. About his mother's mental decline. Interesting definition of general. I stayed quiet. That seemed to make him more uncomfortable than anger would have. Emily leaned forward. Slightly. We were worried because you've been isolating yourself since Harold died. Isolating. Another word added to the list. Fragile. Confused. Emotional. Overwhelmed. Now isolating. Each one carefully chosen to sound compassionate instead of insulting. I suddenly realized Emily probably practiced these conversations in advance. Not the exact words. The tone. Soft concern disguised as authority. I went to the lake house for 3 days. I replied calmly. That's hardly isolation. Daniel sighed heavily again. That sigh? Like every conversation with me had become exhausting. You disappeared without telling anyone. I'm 72 years old, I answered quietly. Not 14. Silence. Emily's jaw tightened for half a second before the sympathetic smile returned. We're not trying to upset you. No, they were trying to reposition me. Slowly. Legally. Emotionally. I could see it clearly now. Daniel pushed his plate away untouched. You're twisting this into something ugly, Mom. That word hit me harder than expected. Ugly. Not painful. Not complicated. Ugly. As though my reaction to humiliation was the real problem instead of the humiliation itself. I studied my son carefully. The lines around his eyes looked deeper lately. Gray threaded through his hair near the temples now. He looked older than Harold did at the same age. Stress changes people. So does guilt. You know, I said softly. Your father spent months preparing legal protections before he died. Daniel froze slightly. Emily stayed perfectly still beside him. I continued calmly. He seemed concerned someone might pressure me after he was gone. Nobody answered. Interesting. If they truly believed they had done nothing wrong, outrage would have come immediately. Instead, silence. Because silence often arrives when truth enters the room. Finally, Daniel spoke. You talked to a lawyer behind our backs? Behind our backs. Another revealing phrase. As though I required permission to protect myself. I spoke to someone your father trusted. Emily folded her napkin carefully beside her plate. Martha, she said gently, this family doesn't need lawyers involved. Family. People always invoke family. Right before asking women to tolerate mistreatment quietly, I almost smiled. Then perhaps this family should stop discussing my competency with banks. That landed exactly where I intended. Daniel's face flushed immediately. Emily looked at him sharply for the first time all evening. Not angry. Careful. Measuring damage. I told you, Daniel muttered defensively. I was asking precautionary questions. About removing my financial independence? No. The word came too quickly. Too loud. Finally. An honest emotional reaction. The room fell silent afterward. I noticed Emily watching him now instead of me. That interested me. Because until this moment, they had operated like a polished team. Now small cracks were beginning to appear. I picked up my water glass slowly. When your father was dying, I said quietly, I sat beside him every day in that hospital. Daniel looked away immediately. I remember, he muttered. Do you? I asked softly. That hurt him. I saw it instantly. Good. Not because I wanted revenge. Because pain was the only thing finally breaking through his denial. You know what I remember most? I continued. Not the machines. Not the doctors. I remember how frightened he was about leaving me alone. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Daniel remained silent. I leaned back carefully. He wasn't worried about my age, I said. He was worried about people. The sentence settled heavily across the table. Outside, wind brushed softly against the dining room windows. The house suddenly felt very quiet. Then Emily spoke again. But something about her voice had changed. Less polished now. Sharper underneath. No one here is trying to hurt you. I looked at her calmly. Then why do I feel managed instead of loved? That one landed harder than anything else I'd said all evening. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Emily looked away. Because there's no strategic response to truth spoken quietly. For months, I thought I needed to defend myself. Now I understood something important. Calm truth forces manipulative people to reveal themselves eventually. Emily reached for her wine glass. I think grief is making everyone overly sensitive. There it was. The final shield. Blame grief. Blame emotions. Blame misunderstanding. Anything except behavior. But the strategy wasn't working anymore. Not on me. I folded my hands together gently on the table. Harold documented conversations before he died. That changed everything. Both of them looked up immediately. Fear. Real fear this time. Small. Controlled. Impossible to miss. Daniel swallowed hard. What conversations? I let the silence stretch deliberately before answering. The ones about the house. Nobody moved. Emily's face remained composed, but I noticed her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. Interesting. Daniel spoke first. You went through Dad's private things? Private things. Again with the phrasing. As though I were intruding into my own marriage. He wanted me to find them. Emily finally lost a little composure then. Not dramatically. Just enough. What exactly are you implying? Implying. Another careful word. I looked directly at her. I'm not implying anything. Silence again. Then very softly, I added, I think Harold understood both of you better than I did. That sentence stayed hanging in the room like smoke. Daniel looked devastated. Emily looked calculating. And suddenly I realized something deeply unsettling. Daniel still wanted my approval. Emily only wanted my position. There's a difference. A very dangerous difference. Dinner ended shortly afterward. Nobody mentioned dessert. Nobody touched the candles. Daniel carried plates into the kitchen mechanically while Emily wiped down the counter in tense silence. I stood slowly from the table and picked up my folder before heading toward the stairs. Halfway up, Daniel called after me quietly. Mom. I stopped. When I turned around, he looked suddenly younger. Almost frightened. What happens now? I studied my son for a long moment. Then answered with the calmest truth I had spoken all week. That depends on whether you still see me as your mother or as an obstacle. I didn't sleep much after that dinner. The house felt different now. Not hostile exactly. Worse. Careful. Like everyone inside it had suddenly realized the game was no longer one-sided. Around midnight, I heard quiet voices downstairs. Daniel and Emily. Arguing. Not loudly. Emily never raised her voice when she was truly upset. She became quieter instead. Sharper. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught pieces drifting through the floor vents. Shouldn't have mentioned the bank. She talked to somebody. Your father planned this. Then silence. I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above the bed Harold and I shared for nearly 4 decades. Funny how quickly grief changes shape. At first, you miss the person. Then eventually, you miss the version of yourself that existed when they were alive. By morning, the house had returned to its polished routine. Coffee brewing downstairs. Emily moving through the kitchen in soft slippers. Daniel already dressed for work even though it was Saturday. Everyone pretending nothing cracked open the night before. I took my time coming downstairs. No rushing anymore. No instinct to keep peace at my own expense. When I entered the kitchen, Emily stood at the counter slicing strawberries into a glass bowl. Bright red against white ceramic. Everything about her always looked staged for photographs. Morning, she said lightly. I nodded once. Daniel avoided eye contact entirely. Interesting. Guilt changes body language faster than anger does. I poured myself coffee slowly and sat near the window. Rain clouds gathered outside again, turning the backyard pale gray. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Then Emily smiled softly. I think yesterday became more emotional than necessary. There it was. Reframing. Always reframing. Not manipulative. Not cruel. Just emotional. I stirred cream into my coffee carefully. Did it? Daniel finally spoke. Mom, nobody's trying to take anything from you. Anything. Interesting choice of word. Not, we hurt you. Not, we crossed a line. Just another denial crafted to sound reasonable. I looked at my son quietly. Then why were you discussing guardianship procedures? The silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel's face drained immediately. Emily froze beside the counter. For a moment, neither of them even breathed. Good, because now they understood something important. I knew far more then. They expected. What are you talking about? Daniel asked carefully. Too carefully. I rested my coffee cup down gently. I spoke with people your father trusted before he died. Emily crossed her arms slowly. You've been going through legal documents behind our backs. Again, behind our backs. As though my own protection somehow belonged to them. I almost smiled. No, I answered softly. I've been discovering what Harold already understood. That landed hard. Daniel looked exhausted suddenly. Older. You're making this sound sinister, he muttered. Sinister. Another interesting word. Because innocent people rarely fear documentation. I watched rain begin tapping against the kitchen windows. Then quietly asked, Did you or did you not ask about power of attorney? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Emily stepped in instead. We were trying to prepare responsibly. There it was. Not denial. Just justification. My chest tightened slightly. Because that told me everything. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. Mom, after Dad died, you stopped eating properly. You forgot appointments. You isolated yourself. Grief. He was describing grief. Like evidence. I suddenly remembered bringing him soup after his divorce scare years earlier. Sitting beside him while he ignored calls for weeks. Canceling plans because he couldn't emotionally function. I never once questioned his competency. Love doesn't do that. Your father died, I said quietly. I was mourning him. Emily's expression hardened briefly before softening again. But grief affects judgment. There it was again, always circling back to instability. I leaned back slowly in my chair. No, I answered calmly. Manipulation affects judgment. The room went still. Emily stared directly at me now. No more polished warmth. No more performance. Just calculation. Finally, honesty. Daniel looked between us nervously like a child trapped between two storms. I think everyone needs to calm down, he said weakly. Weakly. That was the problem with Daniel. Not cruelty. Weakness. He spent his entire life avoiding discomfort until discomfort eventually controlled him. I stood and carried my coffee cup to the sink. Then, very deliberately, I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and removed the house file folder. Harold kept maintenance records there for years. Insurance. Repairs. Tax documents. Emily watched carefully now. I pulled out a single paper and placed it on the kitchen island between us. The property trust summary. Daniel stared at it. Emily went completely still. The house cannot be sold, I said quietly. Transferred, refinanced, or reassigned without my direct approval. Nobody spoke. I continued calmly. And any documented attempt to pressure me financially activates legal review procedures. The rain outside grew heavier. Daniel looked genuinely stunned. You knew about this? He whispered toward Emily. Interesting. Very interesting. Because she didn't answer immediately. That silence told me more than words could. Finally, she said carefully. I knew your father updated some paperwork. Some paperwork. Not an entire legal protection structure. Daniel looked at her now with visible confusion. You told me the house would eventually become ours automatically. Emily's jaw tightened. Well, under normal circumstances. Normal circumstances? I interrupted softly. Nobody moved. I looked directly at my son. Your father built protections because he was afraid of what would happen after he died. Daniel's eyes lowered immediately. Guilt. Real guilt this time. Not defensiveness. Not irritation. Guilt. Emily noticed it too. That's when her tone changed completely. Sharp now. Controlled anger beneath the surface. Martha, I think you're twisting Harold's intentions. No, I answered quietly. I think I ignored them for too long. Silence again. The kind that changes relationships permanently. Then Daniel asked the question I had been waiting for. When exactly did Dad set all this up? I looked at him carefully before answering. Right around the time Emily started discussing property values before his funeral arrangements were finished. The color disappeared from Daniel's face. Emily stood motionless beside the counter. And suddenly, for the first time since Harold died, I realized something important. The power in this house had shifted. Quietly. Completely. And everyone at that kitchen island knew it. Nobody left the kitchen after that. The rain continued tapping steadily against the windows while the three of us stood frozen around the island like strangers accidentally trapped in the same room. Daniel looked physically sick. Emily looked cornered. And for the first time in months, I no longer felt confused. Just clear. Very clear. Daniel stared down at the trust document again before finally speaking. You really think Dad believed we'd try to take advantage of you? The question sounded wounded. Childlike, almost. I looked at my son carefully. I think your father noticed things I refused to see. Emily crossed her arms tightly. This is becoming ridiculous. Interesting. Not painful. Not heartbreaking. Ridiculous. Because people protecting an image care more about appearances than damage. I closed the folder slowly. Is it? Daniel looked toward Emily again, searching for direction the way he always did whenever situations became uncomfortable. That small movement hurt more than I expected. Even now, even after everything, part of him still needed her permission before forming his own thoughts. Emily straightened her posture slightly. Martha, Harold was sick near the end. Fear changes people. There it was. The final strategy. Question the dead man's judgment. Not openly. Just enough. I watched her calmly. Harold updated those protections before surgery, I answered quietly. Before medication. Before complications. Silence. Daniel's breathing looked shallow now. Good. Because reality should feel uncomfortable when you've avoided it long enough. He rubbed his forehead slowly. Mom, if this was all such a concern, why didn't Dad talk to me directly? The question lingered heavily in the room. I thought about Harold sitting quietly at the lake house months earlier. Watching, listening, realizing things. Maybe he already knew the answer. Perhaps, I said softly. He wasn't sure you wanted to hear it. That one landed hard. Daniel looked away immediately. Emily stepped forward before he could respond. You're punishing him emotionally for grieving differently than you. I almost smiled. Emily always returned to emotion whenever facts became dangerous. Everything was about feelings when evidence stopped favoring her. No, I answered calmly. I'm responding to behavior. The room fell quiet again. Then suddenly Daniel asked something unexpected. What exactly did Dad write about us? Us. Not me. Us. Interesting. I studied him carefully for a moment. Part of me wanted to protect him still. That's the tragedy of motherhood. Even when your heart is breaking, instinct keeps trying to shelter your child from consequences. But Harold didn't spend his final months documenting concerns, so I could continue pretending. I opened the folder again slowly. Emily's face tightened immediately. Good. I removed several handwritten pages from Harold's notebook and placed them gently on the counter. Daniel recognized his father's handwriting instantly. I saw it in his eyes. He picked up the first page carefully. March 14th. Emily asked Daniel again about convincing Martha to downsize. Daniel uncomfortable. His face changed immediately. Emily spoke quickly. That was taken out of context. But Daniel kept reading. April 2nd. Heard Emily discussing property values before funeral plans finalized. Another silence. Then another page. Need to finalize protections quickly. Martha too trusting. Daniel swallowed hard. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller somehow. More honest. Emily stepped closer toward him. Harold misunderstood conversations. We were trying to plan responsibly. Daniel finally looked up at her. And for the first time since Harold died, I saw uncertainty in his eyes toward his wife. Not complete realization, but doubt. Tiny. Dangerous. You told me Mom would probably want to sell eventually, he said quietly. Emily's voice sharpened slightly. Because most people your mother's age do downsize eventually. Most people. Not. Your mother wanted to. Not. Your mother asked to. Just another assumption dressed as practicality. I watched them both carefully. The strange thing about manipulation is that it usually collapses slowly, not dramatically. Tiny contradictions. Tiny hesitations. Tiny moments where rehearsed stories stop aligning perfectly. Daniel looked back down at Harold's notes again, then finally whispered, Jesus. That single word carried more honesty than anything he'd said all week. Emily folded her arms tighter. I'm tired of being treated like some kind of villain. I met her eyes directly. No, I said softly. I think you're tired because your version of events stopped controlling the room. That hit harder than I intended. Her face hardened immediately. There it is, she snapped quietly. You never liked me. Interesting. Not. I'm sorry you're hurt. Not. This got out of hand. Just the victim pivot. A tactic Harold warned me about years ago. I stayed calm. I welcomed you into this family. Emily laughed once under her breath. Cold. Disbelieving. This family, she repeated. Harold made every decision. You just stood beside him smiling while he handled everything. The room went completely still. Even Daniel looked stunned. There it was. Finally. The truth underneath years of politeness. Emily never saw me as weak because I was old. She saw me as unnecessary. Decorative. A woman whose value existed only through her husband. And now that Harold was gone, she believed the structure protecting me disappeared too. But she had misunderstood something important. Harold may have built the protections. I was the one willing to enforce them. Daniel stared at Emily in disbelief. You said Dad respected Mom. Emily looked irritated now, not careful. He did. But let's not pretend Martha handled finances or legal matters herself. I almost laughed then. Not from humor. From clarity. Because after months of soft manipulation and polished concern, Emily finally revealed the one thing she truly believed. That dependence equals weakness. I looked directly at her. You're right, I said quietly. Your father-in-law handled many things. Daniel blinked in surprise. Emily looked briefly relieved. Then I continued. But he also spent 39 years teaching me exactly what kind of people to watch for. Silence. Heavy silence. Daniel slowly lowered himself into a chair like his legs suddenly felt unstable. For the first time, he looked less like Emily's husband and more like my son again. Lost. Ashamed. Confused about how things became. This ugly. But Emily remained standing. Rigid. Controlled. Still calculating exits. And that was when I realized something important. This was no longer a conversation about a house. It was about who would control the story of this family after Harold was gone. After that night, the house became unbearably polite. No more arguments. No more forced family meetings. No more careful conversations about what's best moving forward. Instead, silence settled into every room like dust. Daniel left early for work and came home late. Emily stopped using her soft, concerned voice around me entirely. She became distant instead. Cold. Efficient. Like someone recalculating a strategy that no longer worked. And strangely enough, that hurt less. Because once manipulation loses its disguise, at least you can finally see it clearly. 3 weeks later, I moved out. Not because they forced me to. Because I no longer wanted to live inside a house where love had become negotiation. The decision shocked Daniel. You're leaving? He asked when he found me packing books in the bedroom. I folded one of Harold's sweaters carefully before answering. I'm relocating. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Relocating. Funny how he noticed language now. I didn't ask you to leave, Mom. No, I answered softly. You just made staying painful. He looked down immediately. That was the thing about Daniel. Deep down he knew. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not every manipulation. But he knew enough. The lake house needed repairs before winter, so I rented a small cottage near the shoreline instead. White curtains. Tiny kitchen. A porch barely large enough for 2 chairs. It was the first space I'd had in years that felt fully mine. No tension. No performances. No walking on emotional glass. The first morning there, I drank coffee outside wrapped in Harold's old navy sweater while birds moved through the trees above the water. And for the first time since his death, I felt calm. Not happy. Grief doesn't disappear that neatly. But calm. There's a difference. A week later, Daniel visited alone. Emily stayed home. Interesting. He stood awkwardly near the porch steps holding a paper bag from the bakery I used to love when he was little. Blueberry muffins. My favorite. For a moment, he looked 12 years old again. Can I come up? He asked quietly. I nodded once. We sat outside overlooking the lake while cold wind moved across the water in slow silver ripples. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then finally Daniel whispered. I didn't know how bad it had gotten. I looked out toward the shoreline. Yes, I said softly. You did. That hurt him. I saw it immediately. Good. Because healing built on dishonesty never lasts. He rubbed both hands together nervously. I thought Emily was helping. Maybe she thought that too. I answered. And strangely enough, I meant it. Because people rarely wake up deciding to become villains. More often, they convince themselves control is love. Efficiency is care. Protection is authority. Daniel's eyes looked tired. She's angry you left. I almost smiled. Emily preferred me easier to manage. He didn't defend her this time. That mattered. A long silence passed between us while the wind lifted fallen leaves across the porch. Finally he asked, Did Dad really think I'd betray you? There it was. The real wound underneath everything else. I thought carefully before answering. No, I said quietly. I think he feared you'd stay silent while someone else did. Daniel looked down at his hands. Tears filled his eyes then for the first time since Harold's funeral. Not dramatic tears. Not cinematic. Just quiet shame. My whole life, he whispered, Dad handled conflict before it reached us. I nodded slowly. Yes. And that was true. Harold absorbed tension the way strong men from his generation often did. Quietly, steadily, without applause. But after he died, all the things he protected me from remained standing in the open. Daniel stared out across the lake. I don't know how to fix this. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug before answering. Some things aren't fixed by pretending they never happened. More silence. Then finally, do you hate Emily? The question surprised me. I thought about it carefully. The humiliation, the manipulation, the photographs replacing us, the Mother's Day dinner, the discussions about competency and guardianship. And strangely enough, no, I said softly. Daniel looked confused. I think Emily is terrified of becoming powerless someday herself. That was the truth. Women like Emily spend their entire lives trying to outrun vulnerability. Aging frightens them. Dependence frightens them. Irrelevance frightens them most of all. So they control everything before life can control them first. Daniel wiped his eyes quietly. I should have protected you. That sentence settled deep into my chest. Not because it fixed anything, because it was finally honest. The sun began lowering slowly across the lake, turning the water gold around the edges. For a moment, I imagined Harold sitting beside us, smiling quietly into the distance the way he always did during evenings here. Steady, certain, at peace. Daniel left before dark. At the bottom of the porch steps, he turned back toward me. Happy late Mother's Day, Mom. I smiled softly. Thank you. And for the first time in a very long while, the words no longer felt empty. That night, I sat alone on the porch wrapped in a blanket while the lake moved quietly beneath the moonlight. No grand revenge. No screaming ending. No dramatic victory speech. Just peace. Real peace. And somewhere deep inside that silence, I finally understood something my younger self never could. Being a mother should never require begging to be treated like one.